Hey, it's live now.
There's everybody.
We had our own false start here on the back
We
end.
did. I had a whole little pitch already out of the mouth, and
we were talking about John in the comments how stoked we were to see him, and we weren't even live yet.
Yeah, first time watcher or a long time watcher, first time commenter, John. Well, welcome to the party, my friend.
You would think we'd be used to how the live system works.
You would
We've
think.
done this so
Technology,
many times,
man, it gets us too. So, Wendy, welcome back. Happy to have you back on the live stream here, as always.
Always fun to see Wendy. All right, everybody, it's Friday. This is the CUI hotline. We do it every week. I'm Jacob. He's Daniel.
Hello.
This is our complimentary show to the podcast. It's free. It's on YouTube. It's on LinkedIn. It's on Spotify. It's on Apple Podcasts. Tell your friends. Bring your questions. Bring your comments. You go to cuihotline.org. Fill out the form. If you don't want to put it in chat, you can call the hotline if you want to leave a voicemail, and then we'll answer those. And we'll kick it off here. Just so everybody knows, CS2 Reston coming up in May. You can use the code Hotline Reston, which many of you have been using so far.
Yes, thank you.
For 15% off registration. It's going to be awesome. I'm not quite ready to talk about what I'm going to talk about at CS2, but I'll just say it involves taking the CMMC assessment guide, a 276-page document, and reducing it by, I'm going to say 30 to 50% in length without actually changing any of the substance of the content, just reformatting it. So it's going to be a good time. It's going to make it a lot more readable and accessible. It's a project I've been wanting to work on for some time now, but it takes a little bit of time. Should have enough time between now and May. So be sure to register. There's going to be a bunch of awesome sessions like always, and hopefully see you there. There's a virtual attendance option as well if you can't make it to rest.
Yeah, I think they're about to launch the virtual piece. I know the in-person's filling up fairly fast. So
yeah,
this is not like a sales gimmick, but literally like space is limited. So
there is only so much space. Yeah,
I mean, there's only, I think 250, 300 seats.
Yeah, we try to keep it. We try to keep it like in the 200, 250 range because it actually becomes pretty hard to get everybody in and out of rooms to like get coffee and snacks when there's only so much time between sessions. So try to keep
there's
it
not
a little
enough
bit
bathrooms
smaller
at those places either. You know what I mean? You got like a 15-minute line to go to the bathroom. So
yeah. But CS2 is always a good time, and you guys should check it out. All right, Daniel, your week in review. There has been a distinctive tone shift from the primes in our phone calls. You and I have been talking about this all week. I mean, it is a noticeable change in the language that they're using.
And I'll let you use the specific language of the one enterprise that we talked to this week, Jacob. But overall, the general tone of primes is, if I don't have this done yesterday, I am going to basically lose my job. Like we are so nervous that March is going to roll around and there's going to be a solicitation with a CMMC requirement, and we cannot show proof, either fully self-attest or show a certification, which if you're looking for a certification, you're already months and months out probably from that because of the backlog there, which Fernando on the podcast mentioned not too long ago. But it's fascinating. Like 2024 was very much we're going to get to it. It's in the budget. January 1 hit, and the primes are banging down the doors of the implementers from the community that we've talked to and ourselves, right? They are like, oh my gosh, this is real. We got to march forward. We have very tight deadlines. We've got to meet it. Our, C-suite at the very top, our Fed practice, our, whatever it is pushing very, very hard for us to do this. But the funny thing is, not haha funny, but just a reality. The subs that support these primes, which if I mention these primes, you'd be like, oh my gosh. The subs that we're talking to have some urgency, but not enough urgency.
It hasn't trickled down to them yet.
It hasn't. These primes are gobbling up implementers left and right to come do their bidding. And it's going to be very hard for subs to get to an implementer. And the backlog's going to be so long because you have these enterprises of thousands and thousands and thousands of people that have gobbled up teams of people and consultants to do their bidding to make sure that they're okay. And it's the backlog for small businesses is just going to get astronomically long. Yeah. And I really wish I could say from the rooftop, your primes are caring deeply about this. It's time for you to also care about this. Yeah. Because if you do not, you will be at the end of a very, very, very long line because the primes are taking your seat.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we've talked about, Can you survive while you're in line? Maybe, right?
Yeah,
You might be
I
able
hope
to.
so.
It's just very hard to predict. And the longer the line gets, the more there are people ahead of you in line that get through the process, and the less dependent people are on trying to search for people who are still waiting in line,
Yep.
right? So there is no advantage to being as far back in the back of the line as possible if there's no preferential treatment for people who are in line. That's just not how the policy works. But I've noticed, on these calls is like, for a long time, it was people who were contacting us who know what's going on. They're aware of what's going on. They understand what's going on. Very high levels of understanding of the situation, the regulatory process, hopefully helped out by a lot of the content that we've put out there. And they want to get ahead. They want to have an edge. They want to get the drop on people. They don't want to get stuck. There were all these various forward-looking reasons. The last 2-ish weeks from these prime level enterprises, the tone and the language has been very different, right? Specifically, this is what we were talking about earlier. One of these primes, whose people would recognize the name if we told you who it was, they said, this is our nightmare scenario, is what they said on the call. Was we deal with a ton of contracting officers, and we can't predict how or when or which CMMC requirement will come from them in 2025, and we're not ready. We're not ready. And so they're now that it's like after the holidays, looking at awards that they want to target in the second half of this year, and then looking at their implementation and cert timelines, and they're like, we're in a nightmare scenario, is what they said. And so they're waking up to this situation. I hope that everybody who's listening here who's not a prime doesn't have to experience the nightmare by getting ahead of it. The real change was one of them who we talked to. And I was expecting this to happen, but it was just still kind of surreal when it did happen, where we're like, okay, this is the backlog. This is the situation. This is what you're looking at. This is what it looks like through 2025. And they came back and they just said, how much to get to the front of the line?
Right.
Just tell us a number. How much money will it take for us to be at the front of the line? Everyone's freaking out. And I was like, this is crazy. I mean, this is insane. Wild.
Yeah, it is.
So that's happening.
It is happening. And I thought it was going to be a little bit more diverse in the types of people that were going to do this. But what I've realized is the primes are basically hoarding all this CMMC information to themselves and trying to get right size before they flow that down. I think they're all waiting for 7021 to come out, right? 48 CFR to basically be like, oh, we had to wait until it was real to be able to give it to you guys, right?
Yeah, so putting on your oxygen mask before you help someone else put on their oxygen mask is great advice, unless you're the person waiting for them to help you and you can't breathe. Then it's a different, it doesn't seem like great advice. You're like, no, please help me too.
Please. No, I need to breathe.
Yeah. So in contrast,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, in contrast to this situation that we're seeing, meanwhile, on social media,
love the Reddit post on this one.
The anti CMMC flat earthers have completely run away with misinterpreting the regulatory freeze memo, and they are convinced, and they are trying to convince other people while this is going on in our phone calls that this is the death knell for CMMC. We did an entire podcast on it that came out on Thursday. It's only 17 minutes long. You should watch it. It covers exactly what's going on with the freeze memo for the rulemaking process. And long story short, it does not affect CMMC. It doesn't affect CMMC because the regulatory freeze memo affects rules that are already published or rules that have not yet taken effect. The two rules for CMMC, 32 CFR and 48 CFR, 32 CFR is already in effect, which is why you can find it in the Code of Federal Regulations. It's not pending going into effect. So it's not affected by the freeze memo. 48 CFR, in my analysis and estimation, won't be published within the next 60 days. And so it won't be held for additional regulatory review. But this entire question about freeze memos misses the point. Freeze memos don't create new regulatory review. It just makes sure to bridge regulatory review from one administration to the next while the team is transitioning. All rules go through regulatory review. all CMMC rules will go through regulatory review. Regulatory review is one of the few times that you can see on the dashboard what kind of progress a rule is making through the rulemaking process, which is why on the podcast, we always make such a big deal out of it and let people know, hey, the rule has gone up for regulatory review, and now we know where it is in the system. But if you don't know how rulemaking works and you just have an axe to grind about the CMMC program, founded or unfounded, then you're going to see this headline about rulemaking has been frozen. And then, like a lot of people on LinkedIn, be like, well, that's it. Meanwhile, in the background, the actual primes talking to the government are freaking out because they know it's going to happen in a matter of weeks or months. And so there is a massive disparity in what's going on. Please listen to the podcast. It doesn't take that much time. It's very straightforward. We tried very hard to be like, this is the question, this is the answer. It does not affect CMMC the way that you think it does.
The fact that you're in a parka during wildfire season in Los Angeles, that alone was worth looking at. So,
listen, I mean, a lot of this stuff, granted, a lot of this content is very boring. Rulemaking, NIST controls, regulations, it's dry stuff, right? So we got to try to keep it, a semi-entertaining as much as possible. But yeah, I'm proud that I didn't pass out from heat stroke wearing that parka. That's another reason why it went so quickly. Maybe I'll just wear a heavy coat for every episode.
Sweat box.
It'll keep me from ranting because I'm like, I got to get out of this thing. All righty. Let's see here. So we had a couple of questions queued up from last week. So we'll get to those and then we'll get to everybody in the chat.
Perfect.
So one of them that's come up recently quite a bit is, can Summit 7 help companies that only do some DoD work? Or do we only help companies that are 100% of their work is DoD? What if only 40% of their work is DoD or 20% is DoD? I mean, do we help companies like that?
We do. Yeah. So we help companies that are traditional defense contractors. And that's, if I had to guess, that's probably 30, 40% of the portfolio, maybe 50%. But the other half, let's say, are universities with regulated research, construction, architectural engineering companies. What are some other hot ones? I just blanked out here. Manufacturers are usually split, right? Some defense, some non-defense. For most of them. So yeah, I mean, long story short, we work with a lot of companies that a small portion of their business or only a couple of facilities that they want in scope for defense work. And that's where we have to work through kind of a design process with them as part of our scoping calls to make sure that the alignment and the boundary and the logical or physical separations are all kind of making sense for their specific deployment. And then if you go one level further than that, international organizations, now you're dealing with FOCI mitigation, right? Which is kind of its own thing with classified work, because you have a U.S. facility here, a U.S. business. And then you also have, how do I get CMMC international, that we're about to release some content on in the format of a blog. And, all these other kind of nuances, right? Regulatory export control data, for other countries, how does that work? Where's our dividing line there? So long story short, yes, we help a lot of companies that are not 100% CMMC. Maybe it's 10 to 15% or less of their business, right? Sometimes 20% or less. But once you start reaching that 15 to 20% of revenue, usually companies are making that decision to say, hey, we just want to baseline this for the whole organization. And then FAR CUI coming out, that's becoming more and more of a reality where people are like, maybe I should just NIST 800, 171, Rev 2FI my whole environment, right? Because the federal work makes up a very large chunk. Maybe defense is a smaller chunk of that, right? And so, we help a lot of people, no matter the situation.
Awesome. Well, speaking of the FAR CUI rule, so we talked about the FAR CUI rule last week. We got a podcast episode that covers the broad strokes of the FAR CUI rule. It's worth watching because it's been the white whale of the federal CUI ecosystem. I've been talking about this thing for years. Finally, we have eyes on it. One of the questions is, doesn't the FAR CUI rule with new acronyms and forms and all this other stuff, doesn't this conflict with FAR Clause 52.204.21, which is the set of requirements that's verified by CMMC Level 1?
My gut says yes, because they decided to freaking rename the FCI. Like, it's no longer federal contracting information. Surely that's in conflict. I mean...
Well... here's the thing: is this is the proposed rule, so nothing in it technically exists currently. But the thing for people to remember is that the FAR CUI rule is modifying and updating and revising 15 different parts of the FAR. One of those parts is FAR Part 52, which is where the clauses and solicitations live. And so it updates guidance for the agencies, it updates guidance for the contracting officers, it updates overall policy, it updates all these different parts of the FAR. And one of the parts that it updates with the accurate definitions and things like that is FAR Part 52.204-21, this FAR clause. Now, it doesn't change the requirements that are listed in that clause, but it does update definitions. It's going to update and make sure that it points to the right authoritative descriptions of things, the correct policy locations, and all that stuff. So they are not in conflict, because the FAR CUI rule will like all the changes will percolate through all the parts of the FAR from this one rule. So now when you read FAR Part 52.204-21 right now, and then you read the proposed rule, you're like, these don't match. But that's because when the FAR CUI rule is final, all of those changes will propagate through the FAR itself. So not in conflict, being updated and revised via the FAR CUI rule.
So that's FAR 52.204-21. Some people call it the FAR 15 because it lists out 15 things you need to do to protect federal contracting information. My question to you, Jacob, because the FAR CUI does have this attachment, the SF document, that will state what is CUI on behalf of a given contract. My question to you is, do you think it will provide clarity around a more precise definition of FCI?
Well, fun fact, this is something we're probably going to do a podcast episode on. One of the changes through the FAR CUI rule is that FCI is no longer a term. RIP FCI. The new term for what we currently call federal contract information will be controlled federal information. Yes, you heard that right. FCI will now be CFI. You can't make it up. You can't make it up. Personally, I actually like the term controlled federal information better than federal contract information, because we're talking about literally controlled federal information broadly. However, in the FAR CUI rule, it's better than it was in its description of FCI, but it's still mostly a description of what it's not, rather than clear examples of what it is. And so you should go into the FAR CUI rule on the Federal Register, just Control F for controlled federal information or federal contract information. It'll get you to the same spot, and read the description. And if you don't think it's precise enough, you should submit a public comment. Public comments are open until March 17th. And that is a very good thing that you should submit comments on, because all of us would like more clarity around FCI, now CFI, in the future, because they've only ever been able to tell us what it's not. And it's everything that's not CUI and not just purely uncontrolled, unclassified information. So I would love to see some concrete examples. That would be really, really great. So yeah, everybody should submit those comments for sure, but that will change. That acronym will change.
Last question. What's your prediction crystal ball on when FAR CUI would be in a final state and in solicitations? Are we thinking a year and a half?
I don't have the data for how long FAR rules take on average. We only have that data for DoD rules. If you take that window for DoD rules and call it about a year, then I would imagine, let's just call it conservatively the second half of 2026. It could be sooner than that, but I would say, like, if gun to my head, 90% confidence, I would say the back half of next year. But I haven't had a chance to go through the historic database of all FAR CUI rules or FAR rules beforehand. And I don't know if it will be quite as accurate, because the DoD, is a pretty small set of rules since 2009. But about a year and a half, I would call it back half of 2026. Could go faster for some reasons, national security issues, harmonization, trying to leverage authorities, all that other stuff. But I would say second half of 2026, maybe. All righty. Does Summit 7 have partial coverage SLAs? Like, do we do just daytime ops coverage rather than 24/7 ops? What if they just want us to cover the night shift and they have folks that are doing the day shift for their operations? Do we offer that?
We actually don't. We only offer 24/7, period. So that is kind of what we do through and through. We've staffed it appropriately, all U.S. citizens, nothing outsourced at all. So everybody you talk to is a W-2 Summit 7 employee. And we've just decided that 24/7 by default is the best way to do it right now. In the future, can't say that, we wouldn't have price points per SLAs, right? 8 to 5 business hours, after hours, things like that. But right now we're sticking with 24/7.
Gotcha. All right, let's do this one that's in the queue, and then maybe we'll get to some chat and some hotline messages. This one was queued up from last week. Are there any special considerations for Power Platform in GCC High, working Power Apps in this specific cloud enclave?
So the Power Platform is there. Power Apps, Power Pages, Power BI, Power Automate. So that is in the GCC High environment. There are a few kind of known things just to be aware of, right? So when you do a migration, you're going to have to redeploy or reconfigure like your Power BI gateways if you've deployed them on-prem. We had a client actually ask the question a couple of weeks ago saying, hey, can I deploy Power BI gateways in other countries and ingest their data into GCC High? And the answer is yes, as long as you're not ingesting non-licensed export control data from other countries, right? Because GCC High is a sovereign cloud, and specifically US sovereign, right? And so other countries don't have the same luxury that the US has in like a sovereign cloud M365 instance. They were working on one for Germany, I think, for a while back in the day, but that kind of fell on its face from a sovereign cloud perspective. A lot of other things are third-party integrations. So a lot of integrations to GCC High have been hard-coded with .com lookups. So they're using the Graph API in commercial, and they've hard-coded their application because the GovCloud is such a small fraction of the overall addressable market for their integrations.
Yeah.
And so before you do any kind of lift and shift migration, and if you're using integration, external connections for any of your Power Platform, I would highly recommend asking them, can you integrate into the GovCloud API? Because if the answer is no, you can't bring it with you. But overall, the functionality is not full feature parity, but it's pretty close on the Power Platform outside of some of those external connection pieces. So
we need to. I'm gonna write this down for a technical session submission for CS2 called "You Can't Take It With You."
Hey, people ask me that 12 times a day. What can I not bring with me into the GovCloud? So
yeah, actually,
if you have any specific questions or workloads? If you're like, I want Copilot in there, well, Copilot's not there. Or, hey, if I migrate my modern SharePoint site, or if I have these, custom scripts and I need to migrate, if you have any of those questions, shoot me a LinkedIn message and I could be more targeted with my response there.
Gotcha. Quick note before we get to chat. Anybody that's DMing me Dynasty Fantasy Football questions, it's a different show at a different day, and we won't be able to get to them. So just to let you know. All right, let's see here. All right. Wendy said, sorry, I haven't been able to attend the live events for a bit. I mean, there's no obligation to attend them, Wendy. We're happy that you make the time. We're happy for everybody that stops by. We're coming close every week to 100 people between the various platforms that we stream this on. So it's amazing that we get that number of people every week. If you can stop and stay and hang out even for a little bit, it's always fun. Even if you catch it afterwards, not a big deal. People have stuff going on. It's Friday. So, especially on the East Coast, hopefully people are trying to dip out. All righty. Let's see here. John, like we talked about earlier, said hello as well. I've been watching. This is my first time asking a couple questions. So can't wait to see your questions here, John. We're open to any and all of them that we can try to get to. And if we don't have the answer, then we'll go and try to find one.
We'll figure it out
next week. Bruce says hello. Hello to Bruce. Blake says phase 1 CMMC is not supposed to require CMMC level 2 certifications, correct? Unless it's self-attested level 2. Otherwise, only level 1 CMMC should be required for the first year. Well, not quite.
I've got a PowerPoint slide on this one, Jacob.
Yeah,
so.
not quite. So What Blake is referring to is what's known as the phased rollout for CMMC, and this refers to the sequence in which DoD will insert the DFARS 252-204-7021 CMMC contract clause into DoD solicitations. That clause will tell you what level of CMMC you need to achieve in order to take award of that contract. And according to the general plan, these 4 phases determine which levels will be indicated in those clauses according to the quote unquote phased rollout. Now, we can get into your explanation here in a second, Daniel, but the thing for you to know, Blake, is that the big caveat to all of this is DoD's discretion. There is no obligation for DoD to say, well, this is CUI that needs to be protected, but because we're in phase 1, we can't require CMMC level 2 certification. They basically caveat everything in the 32 CFR final rule that says we're not planning on doing that, but we can do that according to our discretion. So there is no guarantee that there won't be CMMC level 2 certification requirements. And based off of, like we talked about at the top of the show, what we're hearing from the primes on the phone right now about things they're expecting later in the year, I would not take it as a guarantee that CMMC level 2 is, there's a moratorium on including it in contracts until Q2 of 2026 or whatever.
Yeah, so 2 kind of pieces to highlight. Like Jacob said, it's at DoD's discretion. If the MAPS RFI that got dropped in December is any indication of what contracting officers want to do, that is they want to put certifications into solicitations. That's, it's kind of a leading indicator. And they also CYA, right? They want to cover themselves and just make sure they're not screwing up. So they're going to go with the highest bar. Now, is that the right thing to do? Probably not, at least according to phase 1. But they have the ability to do that, to what Jacob was saying, right? The DoD can, at their discretion, decide to include that into contracts. Now, the other 2 pieces of this, that's the DoD's timeline. That's not your prime contractor's timeline. They will very likely ask you to get certified way faster because they know how long it takes for a company to become certified ready, right? 6, 12, 18 months, typically, depending on your size, right? And so that's the other piece of this. The DoD's timeline, if you're a sub, is not probably your timeline. You need to talk to your prime on what they will require when. And then the last piece of this is if your prime has a requirement at a contract level to be certified, it will also require you to be certified. So there's not Boeing gets certified and their supplier, Joe's Machine Shop, can self-attest. It is a contract requirement, as Jacob has said, not a company-based requirement or exemption. So it's if Papa's got it, the kid's got it too, right? And so you just got to make sure that you're having open and frequent communications with your primes, because their timeline, what they're expecting, and they might want to be proactive and assume a certification requirement very early on, even though phase 1 clearly states most things should be self-attesting to start. They might want to choose to go after work that does require certification, and in turn will require you to be certified. So,
all right, tag me back in because I got some more
you're
stuff
in.
for you, Blake.
Get there. Go in there.
So, other things to consider when it comes to this question. The original conception of CMMC in 2020, what is commonly referred to as CMMC 1.0, said that during their original idea of the phased rollout, they would only include CMMC certification requirements in contracts when the Undersecretary of Defense actually approved those to go in, which is it's a very high bar to get them to sign off on when that's going to go in. So the number of certifications during the original phased rollout would have been very small until you get to full implementation. This version of CMMC does not have the same bar. It leaves the level of discretion up to the PMs. So it is scattershot all of the discretion to all of the people much, much lower down. So the bar for potentially seeing those requirements in much, much lower. The other thing to think about here, we don't do what a lot of people do on LinkedIn, where they go, I heard a rumor that this is going away. I heard a rumor that this is slowing down. We hear lots of rumors all the time, but until we can substantiate them or talk about them specifically with something that you can click on and read, we don't try to peddle rumors as much as possible. But this is a live show. Everybody here has been here for 30 minutes. So let me tell you a little rumor that I heard, a little rumor that I've heard going around the grapevine. The line between CMMC level 2 certification and CMMC level 2 self-assessment is whether or not you have controlled technical information or not. The odds of you being able to self-assess if you have controlled technical information are essentially zero, according to the rumors that I've been hearing. So we'll wait for the guidance to come out and wait for confirmation before we make a podcast and an episode like that. But I beg of you, please do not bet on CMMC level 2 self-assessment if you work on anything related to a weapon system component, unless you're dealing with other categories of CUI for the DoD for some reason. That is not a long-term probability that you can get away with self-assessment.
So in the defense category, if I'm hearing you right, controlled technical information, DoD critical infrastructure security information, naval nuclear propulsion information, privileged safety, and unclassified controlled nuclear information. If you're falling into those categories of CUI, be prepared to have a certification requirement in phase 1. Is that fair to say, Jacob?
Yeah. I mean, I can't.
Okay. Just
there's
making
no
sure.
way that if they're going to have a contract that involves unclassified naval nuclear propulsion information that goes out between the end of this year and Q1 of 2026, that they're going to go, well, we're in phase 1, so we're not going to require the cert. That's just not going to happen. That's just not a viable way to look at it.
Man, this was talk about a hot take.
Yeah, good job, Blake.
Blake, you just got it out of us, man. You should come on every week here.
We've been harping on the self-assessment thing. Like, do not let that lull you into a false sense of security for external assessments. Wendy says phase 1 does not mean you can sit around until December doing nothing. Yeah,
100%.
Absolutely correct. Man, this is going back and forth. Blake said, yeah, obviously not. But to need it yesterday seems misguided. Plus, the last 4 years has been intended to prepare. What have people been doing? Well, Blake,
I love it.
I hate
he's
to
following the industry is what he's doing.
I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but a lot of people haven't been doing anything, which is why the panic is starting to set in, unfortunately. But as you've said before many times, Daniel, it is not an impossible thing to achieve. At all. We've helped 1,000 different companies now in our portfolio who are defense contractors of all shapes and sizes and industries and exposure, and deal with these requirements. And almost 20 of them now have their level 2 certification, either through joint surveillance or actual commercial assessment. So it's 100% possible to achieve. But Blake, for a lot of people, until there is a clear and present danger of consequence, they kick the can. So
I will say this. The reason I know people haven't been doing things is I talk to them 10 times a day and have for the last almost 6 years. But number 2 is that the supply chain hasn't organically shrunk. If people were loading their rates with what it took to do CMMC, those businesses, and this is not a popular opinion, but those businesses would not have won the work that they are currently winning.
Yeah.
And so because the market hasn't organically shrunk, I can honestly tell you that people have not been doing it because the industry has stayed about the same, maybe even grown a little bit. Maybe it's consolidated, right, with some acquisitions. But I can say all that to say is there wouldn't be 10 suppliers coming after producing one part. There would be 2 or 3 suppliers by this point if they were doing things correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. Barr says, if you knowingly self-report a faulty SPRS number during phase 1, you will be found out when you are independently assessed and likely penalized. Yeah, that is a great point. If you submit your SPRS score and then people show up later to conduct your assessment for an independent DIBCAC assessment or a CMMC level 2 assessment, and there's a massive disparity, that is a clear red flag. The folks at DIBCAC, the folks at DoD, at the various presentations that they've given over the last 2-ish years, bring this up all the time, where the first people that they will go look at are people with perfect scores in SPRS. And almost every time they do that, the actual score when they get done is like 100 points less. And so it is not a wise thing to do in terms of your SPRS scoring numbers, because now your CMMC assessment produces a score with the same scoring criteria as you had to make for your quote unquote SPRS score. They are now the same system.
So let's go a step further than that. And I think there's some lawyers that listen to this show, but someone needs to correct me if this is not true. What I have heard that if you have an NDA with your assessor, your C3PAO, and the DOJ wants to follow a False Claims Act, a lot of times that NDA would require notification of you that the DOJ is requesting information on this behalf. But as far as I understand, the assessor would have to return those results to the Department of Justice, even with an active NDA in place. So DOJ is probably going to be looking and targeting C3PAOs to fess up to if companies were actually aligned with what their self-assessment was. That's just a shot in the dark, but they are kind of a perfect honeypot because they know the truth on if somebody was misrepresenting who they are or not. So do not do that. If that is not true, I take it back. But if it is true, that's even more dangerous to incorrectly self-report your SPRS score.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Elvis says, how do you see 800-171 revision 3 impacting the DIB this year? It will not affect the DIB this year. It may affect the DIB next year. The trigger for 171 Rev 3 and 172 Rev 3 for affecting the DIB will be when 32 CFR Section 170, the CMMC program regulation, gets updated via rulemaking to point to the new revisions of the requirements. The reason why you are assessed against 800-171 revision 2 and the current version, 800-171 revision 2 and the current version of 800-172 is because those revisions, those numbers are hard-coded into the regulation. Currently, your DFARS 252-204-7012 contract clause is a bit of an anomaly because it says you are obligated to implement the most current version of the NIST standards that are out at the time of your contract solicitation, which causes a massive problem because DFARS 7012 says, if you read it by itself, implement 171 Rev 3. And CMMC now says, we're going to assess you against 171 Rev 2. So they solved this problem through something known as a class deviation, which is a guidance document, essentially a DFARS-wide waiver. And that class deviation says only do 171 Rev 2 until further notice. And that further notice will be, you could call it CMMC 3.0 final rule. That rulemaking internally is underway right now. And so I would imagine that we would see that proposed rule end of this year, beginning of next year. So you're thinking maybe 2026-ish timeframe at the very soonest for when that would come up. So it will not affect companies in 2025, may not affect companies until later on in 2026. There'll be a whole kerfluffle around additional updating rulemaking for CMMC before we get to the new revisions. Still something to be aware of, but not in the immediate future. All righty, let's see here. Michael said, with all the stress associated with CMMC, do you think the DoD should offer a hotline to offer cyber emotional support therapy for the DIB?
Oh, Michael.
I don't know if I don't know if the DoD or most federal agencies are qualified to provide the most emotional support. I think they probably need their own hotline.
Also, after being in the rooms with some of them, empathy is not the word that comes to mind when it comes to consoling, the ability to console people. But yeah, that's what we're here for. We will be your hotline. Jacob, you've said it multiple times. There's going to be a point in the calls, the intake calls that we take, that you're going to have to be a licensed counselor, therapist, 911 dispatcher, because people are going to call in and say, I don't have a business anymore if you guys don't do this for me. Right. And I'm waiting for that. It's kind of sprinkled in the past couple of years, but I have a feeling it's going to pick up steam here shortly. So maybe we should go through some of that training. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All righty. Well, here's the guy that I call for emotional
what a
support.
treat.
There he is. First time caller, long time listener. Jason says, do you guys see anything within the FAR CUI rule which may trigger some changes during the next DoD CUI rulemaking update cycle? So to put it another way, is there anything in the FAR CUI rule that when DoD goes through rulemaking for DFARS clause 7012, that would sort of trickle down into that clause. Yes, there is some stuff that would trickle through it, updates to definitions, updates to acronyms, potential updates to reporting timelines. They might mirror that in 7012, or you just have both clauses independently. Probably the biggest one, which is probably what Jason's hinting at here, is FedRAMP equivalency, because the FAR CUI rule does not use the word equivalency. It says when you use a cloud service to handle CUI, you have to make sure that that service provider, cloud offering meets the requirements of the FedRAMP moderate baseline, not 800.171. It's a different baseline, much bigger, much bigger, right?
And not FedRAMP moderate authorized.
Not FedRAMP moderate authorized. They don't have to have the certification, the authorization, the ATO package. They just have to meet the requirements. So the operative thing to do here is to submit a public comment and go, what the hell does meet the requirements mean? Because in DFARS 7012, the reason that they use the word equivalency is because circa 2015, 2016, there were so few FedRAMP authorized cloud service offerings that they said, well, we don't want to cut you. Literally, their words are, we didn't want to cut you out of the cloud, but there are obligations for this data when it's in the cloud. So if you can't use a FedRAMP authorized offering, make sure it's equivalent to the requirements. And then we'll just take your word for it that you did that.
So let me follow that up a little bit, because FAR CUI is, from a certification perspective, not required. They're kind of leaving that to the agencies to decide, hey, do you want to certify people in this to some degree, right? So just because FAR CUI doesn't say it, if the agencies are requiring a certification, they will probably have something similar to the CMMC assessment process or some kind of overarching organization doing certifications, and they might call out something a little bit more specific or more burdensome for an assessor to do if they are a baseline, right? So, just like we've talked about with equivalency, full body of work, no POHAMs. I mean, there might be some dramatic additional scope added to an assessment if you didn't use an authorized provider, but that's all speculation on my side. So
yeah, absolutely. And everybody, make sure you register for CS2 Reston, because Jason is going to be there giving awesome presentation like always. So if you want to see Jason, then you can see him at CS2. All right. So thanks to the magnificent backend producer Dustin. So John submitted this comment. He said, "I've been watching. First time asking a couple questions." Dustin connected the dots. John submitted a form question. So let's see here. So do CMMC requirements intersect with commercial aerospace suppliers, for example, SpaceX's Starlink system? Okay, so as far as CMMC requirements go, that is specifically a DoD program to verify the requirements pursuant to DFARS Clause 252, 204, 7012. So regardless of application or what's going on, if you have a defense contract with the DFARS 7012 clause in it, and you handle relevant types of covered data, then you are likely going to need a CMMC level 2 certification, right? That's the way that the process will work. If you're a commercial aerospace supplier and you don't have the DFARS 7012 clause, then all the stuff that follows along with that 7012 clause wouldn't apply to you, right? Even though there are probably a lot of people who would like it to, doesn't technically apply just by default at this point.
Now, I want to add a little follow-up to that. And I haven't seen an update on this in a couple of years, but back in 2022, Space Force was actually looking at cybersecurity requirements at a NIST 53 baseline at a, I can't think it was a high baseline. It was called IA Pre. It was what this was called that they were developing, that would force commercial providers of satellite services to meet certain requirements. So again, I haven't heard an update of this in, I want to say, a couple of years. They were going to make it a contingent of contract award and things like that as well, similar to CMMC. I believe it was also a certification requirement, at least when it was initially announced. So if you are doing this, just know that this very well still might be alive and kicking, and it's probably worth doing some additional pursuant to see what Space Force has updated or what their new timeline is for rollout of IA Pre, if it affects you as a commercial provider of satellite services.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing to consider, so there's been a lot of stuff in the news, if you haven't noticed, about lots of new executive orders, the current administration rescinding and repealing previous executive orders, except for one big one, and that was the executive order on strengthening and promoting innovation in the nation's cybersecurity. It's a massive executive order, and it talks about all kinds of spicy topics. My favorite particular topic is the inability for the government to have any assurance whatsoever by taking just industry's promises that they're doing cybersecurity. This one specifically focuses on software vendors. You've heard like CISAs of the world and a lot of these organizations, being like, take the pledge for good cybersecurity. And the executive order was like, they're taking the pledge and they're not doing anything.
Fortinet needs to be on whatever list that is. Can I just say, there's so many bulletins about freaking Fortinet, vulnerabilities every day. I get CISA bulletins about freaking Fortinet. So anyways, Fortinet's probably the reason that this executive order was put into place. That's all I'm going to say about that. So,
all right, breaking news here. I messed up. Bruce asked this question, not John. It's not Dustin's fault. I can't read. Now it's been corrected. Dustin can stop freaking out on the internal chat. Long story short, if you look at this executive order and you search for space systems, you will find a lot of treatment of the government trying to get its hands around cyber requirements for commercial space systems, specifically around ground systems for commercial space systems. So I would have you look for this executive order. You can't find it on the White House website because all the links have changed, but you can find it in the good old Federal Register. And so if you find it in the Federal Register, it's a great read, especially if you're interested in maybe what's coming down the line for commercial aerospace suppliers. But as far as CMMC goes, not a federal requirement, just a DoD requirement. So if you're not dealing with the DFARS 7012 clause and the relevant type of CUI, then CMMC wouldn't necessarily affect you, although in the future, according to this, it possibly could. All righty, let's see here. Okay, here we go. This was a thread on Reddit from the other day. Daniel, interested in your in your take here. Let me see if I can pull this up.
My company needs CMMC level 3. Can a single person get us ready for CMMC level 2?
So they need level 3. Yeah, that's great for whatever reason.
Yeah,
they're one person, and their first stop on their journey to level 3 is CMMC level 2. Can one person do CMMC level 2 all in, everything that they need to do? This person seems a little overwhelmed. How feasible is it for a single person to do everything that a company maybe like Summit 7 would assist a company in doing?
Okay. I'm going to say yes. If, number one, the scope, right? If you're one person and that's just the whole size of the company, you probably can do this to some extent. The problem that we see all the time, well, I'll list off why I think they can do it. CMMC doesn't have organizational defined parameters, meaning no one's prescribing you how frequent or how often you should be doing things, right? Now, there's some general rules to play by that assessors want to see, like at least an annual review of your SSP, logs review, typically at least, once a month or once a quarter, right? And again, there's kind of certain things they just want to see just to show that you're doing the work, right? So I think, yes, if you have the ability to control all of those aspects and you know how to do all of those things, the technical side, the non-technical side, the physical access control side, and are the Swiss Army knife of the 14 control families, right? And so you could do it if that is a person that works for your company and it's not just a one-person company. I can tell you right now, Lockheed's about to pay him $300,000, $400,000, him or her, to go do that for them.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I'm going to say exactly what Ryan Bonner, the great and powerful Ryan Bonner, has always said. If you are one of the 6 people that I can think of off the top of my head who could top to bottom do literally everything required for CMMC level 2, then you should take a page.
Being one of those people, by the way.
Then you should take a page out of Scott Edwards's book and start an MSP, because you are being wildly underpaid, right? The second that somebody would know how to do even a significant portion of these requirements, the company that's employing them probably can no longer afford them if they decide to go look around. So if you, Reddit poster, can do these things, congratulations, because the world is your oyster at this point. If you are a company and you have a person who is doing all of these things, one, they're probably not. So please check on their mental health. But two, if they really can do it, then back up the Brinks truck if you don't want to lose them, because they're probably already have 1 foot out the door.
Yeah, you need to go ahead and bring them into the equity circle at that point if they are actually doing that for you.
Yeah, they are your company. All right, we got some hotline messages. Let's listen to them.
All right.
Hi, here. We scheduled a CMMC Level 2 certification assessment in July of 2025, and we use a federal enclave, the Azure GCC High Cloud, for CUI data. A question came up. We have 2 project sites that will handle FCI data but no CUI data. So the level 1 controls are in effect. Now, physical security at those sites includes closed circuit TV cameras on all the entrance exit doors, card access control system, and door ajar alarms. Do the vendors for these products have to be FedRAMP moderate authorized? And what about logging of those events? Does the logging tool have to be FedRAMP moderate authorized? I believe they just need to be compliant with the NIST 800-171-R2 for those controls. I need your advice on that, or opinion. Thank you.
All righty.
Great
Advice
question.
and or opinions, Daniel?
I've got many. So I'm going to pull up the level 1 scoping guidance from the DoD, right? And a few things out of the gate. Number one, it's very simple compared to level 2 because there's in-scope assets and there's out-of-scope assets, and there's also specialized assets, right? OT, government property, technology, things like that. So one thing to be aware of, and you're lucking out here, CMMC level 1 does not require FedRAMP clouds at all for either security or just processing, storing, or transmitting of federal contract information. So not only the security tools don't have to be FedRAMP, the actual cloud providers don't have to be FedRAMP. So you can meet CMMC level 1 requirements in like the Microsoft commercial cloud today. You can absolutely do that. So if that site is processing, storing, and transmitting CUI, I know you mentioned NIST 171, then the security protection assets like the physical badge access and things like that also don't have to be FedRAMP clouds because they're not processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, right? So identity authentication is not considered controlled and classified information unless we're getting into the world of federal federal employees, right? There's a little bit of an exemption there where that could be controlled and classified information depending on the type of data being transmitted. But from an organization standpoint, you are good to go. FedRAMP is not a requirement for FCI for either the actual data or the things protecting that data. So there you go.
Awesome. So semi-related, you can probably just leave that up there for this one. Semi-related, is CMMC level 1 a prerequisite for CMMC level 2?
Good question. And the answer is kind of yes and no. And the reason that is CMMC level 2 builds on top of level 1. So if you're going level 2, you're automatically going to actually implement the controls required at a level 1 level. Now, there's one small caveat to that, and that is a lot of people say, Daniel, can I just start with CMMC level 1? And I come back and say, yes. However, some of the decisions around the cloud providers you are going to use, you need to go ahead and assume that you're going level 2 because of the FedRAMP requirement. So if you say, Daniel, can I start with level 1 in commercial and then go level 2? I'm going to come back and tell you, yes, but you're going to have to do a reconfiguration in the Microsoft Gov Cloud, re-implementation of all of the controls instead of just an upgrade of the controls. So what I tell people is, if you're going to plan on level 2 in the next 12, 18 months, go ahead and get the migration and the base implementation done in the Gov Cloud, and then do a Delta configuration to level 2. But that way, when you get to that point, you don't have to migrate and do a huge disruption of your business at that time. It's just an upgrade of the security controls.
Yeah. Contrary to the name, and this is a longer story we don't have time to get into about where the requirements at CMMC level 1 came from, a document called FIPS 200, and where the requirements at CMMC level 2, 800-171 came from, NIST SP 853, are not intended to be a maturity model. And so when you derive a program from those two things that are related, but not in that way, and you just call it a maturity model, that doesn't mean that it is a maturity model. That doesn't mean that the level 1 requirements are even the best place to start, as Daniel said. So it's not a prerequisite. It's not even necessarily the best place to start for level 2. Level 2 subsumes those requirements. But that's a story for another day. We have, we got another call here. Okay. Yeah, we got time. Here we go.
Good morning. My name is, and I did fill out the CUIHotline.org online form, but I had to call the number because this is just an incredible resource. Everything Summit 7 puts out has been so helpful as someone working in compliance for a defense contractor that is trying to get ducks in a row for CMMC to hit in contracts sometime this year. My question is the same as what I submitted online, but my question is around Trump's executive order on the regulatory freeze pending review. Just wanted to see what your expectations are, if that would affect the CMMC ruling, Title 48, things of that nature. Just wanted to know what your thoughts were. Thanks so much. Looking forward to listening in to the live on Friday.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for the very kind words. I know Jacob's got a lot of feelings about the regulatory freeze, so much that he suited up in a parka yesterday for the podcast. So, Jacob, I know we addressed at the beginning part of the call, but you want to do a quick recap for those new people joining us today?
Yes, absolutely. So for anybody that didn't catch it, we had a whole podcast on this topic on the freeze memo specifically. The long story short is it doesn't affect CMMC at all. It doesn't affect CMMC specifically, and it doesn't affect rulemaking in general, because regulatory review is a normal part of the rulemaking process. Freeze memos at this point are a normal part of the rulemaking process because every administration has issued a freeze memo since George W. Bush. So it's been a thing for 20 years now. All it does is say that all the rules that are currently on deck that are about to be published in the Federal Register, or that are published in the Federal Register and about to take effect some amount of time later, are going to be reviewed by the incoming team so that nothing gets dropped, essentially, right? That regulatory review process isn't new or different. That's the normal regulatory review process that those rules would have gone through if they were published 2 weeks later, right? And so, no, it does not affect CMMC specifically. It is not a freeze of any specific rule whatsoever. It just says that no rules will take effect for 60 days while everybody gets the new butts and seats for the people who review the rules at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Now, that hasn't stopped people online from running with this as basically straight up fake news, straight up disinformation about what it means. So no, it does not affect the CMMC rules specifically. If you'd like some more details, we go into all of it on the podcast on our channel that came out yesterday. And unfortunately, because we use words like administration, Biden, Trump, George W. Bush, it gets flagged as a political video. So you're going to have to go find the video because the algorithm will not suggest it to you because it's been flagged as political content. So, shame on us for trying to correct the record for people putting out incorrect information. So if you could go search for that video and subscribe, and share it with your friends, that would really help us out, because
we need the CEO of YouTube to go on Joe Rogan and get things right about the censorship situation.
Man, yeah,
everybody else apparently has. So
it is what it is. All right, we got some more stuff queued up. We got stuff in chat we won't be able to get to. Let's just get to maybe one more queued up question before we get out of here for Friday. Nice, quick, easy technical one for you. Is virtual desktop a good option for very small organizations, like less than 10 to 12 users?
So yes and no. So it is, because it's a really clear boundary. Everything you're doing is in the cloud, the compute, the collaboration services, all of that. However, the two downsides of it are cost of running a virtual environment for a small business. You don't want that. You want that to keep as low as possible. And doing virtual compute can be kind of expensive, even for such a small number of people. And then number two is, oh my gosh, I just lost it. Cost and boundary. So if you need any more than like 15% of your user population needs to access CUI, people don't work very well in two parallel environments, right? Think about how much you hate two cell phones, right? If you have a company that gives you a company device, right? And so same thing with an enclave. You have to assume the user is using that environment, and you have to tighten down the other commercial or corporate environment to make sure they're not using that for CUI. That's the biggest kind of risk that we see. So cost is an impact for small business. And then are they going to use it if it ends up looking like two different systems? And then the other side of it as a pro is it's a very clean and crisp boundary. So if you have the money and you put some good policies in place and good auditing in place to make sure people aren't using that other environment, I would say go for it.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, that's been an hour already. It always flies by. If we didn't get a chance to get to your questions that are already queued up, or we didn't get a chance to get to your questions in chat, we will queue those up for next week. Sorry that we couldn't get to them this week. If you find this video after the stream is over, you can leave a comment, leave a chat message, and we'll queue those up accordingly. You can always fill out the form at cuihotline.org or call the number and leave a voicemail if you're short on time, and we'll queue those up as well. And we do this every week. We do the podcast every Thursday. Make sure to register for CS2 Reston coming up in May. We're going to have a bunch of awesome information. And yeah, check out our website, our blog. We got a bunch of free tools and resources on there, like our Pathfinder tool, which, Daniel, I found out the other day, most popular video on our YouTube channel in 2024 last year. 128,000 people viewed that.
Golly.
Yeah. So check that one out. It's a free tool. It tells you how to get started if you have no idea where to start. And then we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
See you guys. Have a good one.